Welcome. We're going to be talking in this series about the beauty and power of biblical poetry, and hopefully help you understand a little bit about how to read biblical poetry, which is just really an exciting subject. I really love biblical poetry, and it really is such an amazing world once you start understanding the way that it works. You would think maybe that modern Israelis would be able to open the Bible and read biblical poetry just like that. But actually, there is a problem for the Israelis in that the biblical language is different actually from modern Hebrew, and the meanings of some words have changed, and not all Israelis can straight away understand the way that the biblical poetry works. So in a sense, for those who are reading translations, you've got an advantage. It's easily understandable in the translation. But here, there's also something that I think you need to understand, that poetry in itself, if you're not aware of the way that it works, you're going to miss a lot, which is why it's really worth understanding the way that biblical poetry works if you're reading in translation. And maybe this will whet your appetite a little bit for getting some tools also into being able to use the Hebrew. There's different ways you can do that, which maybe we can talk about some other time. But even if you're just working from translation, at least some pointers on how to read this poetry, I think, will really help you to come to terms with the text more. So, of course, biblical poetry is not limited to the book of Psalms. There are poems in the books of the Torah. There are poems in the historical books. The Song of Deborah, for instance, the Song of Hannah. There's different poems. And then there's whole books that are actually written either all the book or partially in a poetic style. Many of the prophetical books are written in a poetic style. The book of Proverbs, the book of Job is written in Hebrew in a poetic style. So it's really important to come to terms and to come to grips with a little bit of how to read this kind of literature in the Bible. The first question, of course, is, and this is what we'll be looking at today, okay, biblical poetry, so what is poetry? How do you define poetry? How do you define a literary text as poetic? Of course, there's different approaches to this. And what I want to look at, just very briefly, is more different elements or characteristics of biblical poetry, which actually, at least some of them, characterize poetry generally, I would say also. So the first characteristic of poetry, and especially you can see this in the Bible, is terseness, brevity, pithiness. The poet says a lot in a very short space with a limited number of words. That's the reason that it's also so important to understand the importance of each word within the poem. There's a lot of weight given to each word. A poet can use words in ways that are different as well than in a narrative, ways that are original. So we really need to look at the terseness and the way that this works. One really good example, actually, that others have given, but I will give this to you here, of really to see the difference between narrative and poetry in the Bible, is the story of Sisera and Yael. You remember Sisera came into Yael's tent when he was running away from the battle, and Yael killed him. Well, this story is told firstly in Judges 4 in a narrative way. And in Judges 4 verse 19 it says, he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. Then she covered him. that's the way that this portion of the story is narrated in narrative form. But then the next chapter, actually, we have a poem, a song, and the same portion of the story is narrated here. And here it says, he asked for water, she gave him milk. This is in Judges 5, verse 25. He asked for water, she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl, she brought him curds. It's important to notice, firstly, that there's less words in the poetry, and actually this is even more noticeable in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the phrase is, he asked for water and she gave him milk. There are only 2 words in each of those phrases. It's very clear that this is more terse, and there's no and between them. So 2 of the ways that this terseness is expressed in the Bible is by what is called parallelism and by metaphor. So let's think first about parallelism. That is one of the ways that we can see, oh, this is a poetic text. One of the things you'll notice reading the Bible is this literary device called parallelism, which, as the name suggests, is the paralleling of 2 short sentences or phrases, one next to the other, which either repeat the thought or develop the thought or in some way are connected. And this is very characteristic of biblical poetry. It actually does occur in narrative, but not nearly as much. So its intensity is a characteristic of biblical poetry. One example from the verse we read from Judges 5:25 is the parallelism which says, water he requested, milk she gave. The parallelism between water, milk, he requested, she gave. There's a lot of beauty in this, and we'll have a separate video on parallelism itself and how to identify and understand it and the different ways that it works. So the next characteristic is metaphor, or generally I would say imagery. Poetry is characterized by figurative language. This happens a lot in poetry. Again, it happens in narrative, but it especially is characteristic of poetry. There are different ways that you can understand metaphor, but one such way, which a Hebrew writer called Shimon Sandbank suggested, is that metaphor is a mutually significant meeting of 2 different thoughts or concepts. One is the main thought and the other is the secondary thought. Or in other words, metaphor is the conceptualization of one area of thought in terms of an area of thought that's different from it. Again, we'll go into more depth in this in a separate video. So parallelism, metaphor, and also another characteristic of poetry is what I would call integration or connectivity. Together with the terseness, the pithiness of the language, poetry is characterized by the connections between its parts. The different parts, the different literary devices form an association by being together, and sometimes not even necessarily together in the immediate sentence, but together in the poem in a way that leads us to the message. And it's really important to understand that often a poem can speak in many ways, but actually if we look at these different devices and see the whole thing together, then it's actually giving us often a simple message, or it's saying to us one thought. And that's something really important to pick up on when we're reading poetry, and that includes biblical poetry. And the last thing that I would want to mention is characteristic of poetry, again, including biblical poetry, is individuality. And here it's really important to recognize the individuality of each poem and each poetic text. There's different ways that a poem can express itself. And we can't judge one poem by what we know of another poem. There's a modern thinker who wrote a lot about modern poetry called Michael Riffertail, who called this the subcode of the poem, a kind of special language that the specific poem has. And it's really important to catch on to that language, to learn that language, to identify that language of the poem that I'm reading, the way that it's working, and not to come at it with an assumption that, well, because I know the way that that other poem works, or this kind of poem works, then I'm just assuming that this is where it's, because poems are full of surprises, and each poem is a world in itself. So we're really hoping that during the series we'll be able to help you a little bit to identify those things that are very individual to each poem, and to really enjoy the riches that you will see as you get to grips with the beauty of biblical poetry.